Here is Fox's Harris Faulkner. What was the clip that we had of her recently that I was like, wow, she's really missing? They're not necessarily full deck. I mean, this is
it was the Condi one where they were talking about failure in Iraq and no sense of irony or hypocrisy whatsoever. Just like, oh yeah, okay.
Harris Faulkner, literally born sometime in the past 5 or 6 years. And but here she is talking with the American Petroleum Institute CEO, Mike Summers. Well, let me just ask you guys, not for nothing, what do you think this guy's agenda might be? But here she is. She's asking, this is honestly like, it's like if this was somebody's dad in my kid's elementary school class who was coming in for the day to talk about what he did. And some kid raises their hand and asks this question, except for this person is on one of the largest cable news outlets in the country. Here's Harris Faulkner with the CEO of the American Petroleum Institute.
Online faster. And we want to make sure that we're putting those policies in front of the Biden administration. But so far, the proposals that we've put forward have fallen on deaf ears.
I think you're talking about red tape. And when I hear you say that, I think about one thing. Operation Warp Speed. Come on, we can do this. We did what the rest of the world couldn't with the last administration in Operation Warp Speed. We wiped away that red tape. And I say we as Americans, right? And then we got vaccines, plural. Why can't we do that with oil?
Well, we actually have an example of it happening with oil here in the United States during World War II. We know that we have the resources here. The American forces in World War II and our allies were benefited by American oil that really fueled the resistance in Europe. We can do it again, and we're proud to do it because the companies that I represent at the American Petroleum Institute want to step up to this moment because they're patriots, and we want to supply the world with American natural gas and oil during this critical time.
I hope the White House and the Biden administration start to listen to wiping away that red tape because, again, and I keep saying it, we don't have enough time to deal with it in the slow motion that we're acting now. Mike Summers, great.
Did you notice his little subtle shift where she's talking about Operation Warp Speed to get us oil? And he goes, we have the know-how to provide the world with oil. And that is because the oil that we produce in this country, that we dig up from our country, is generally not used in this country. Our refineries are for heavier crude, apparently, than what we actually dig up. I mean, this is just their way of saying, like, can we get more leases? And they're sitting on a ton of leases. It really is just, I think, just about like, what can we get more subsidies ultimately?
Yeah, absolutely. And I also think about just generally reframing the conversation, as you mentioned earlier, about climate change from like, putting the immediacy of the gas prices, of the shortage, quote unquote, of domestic oil and gas on par with the sort of the overarching climate change immediacy as well. So, using the same language, like we can't wait forever for, gas prices to go down. This is a national emergency. And I think that's why, when we talk about getting Americans off of fossil fuels, we have to speak generally and not just off of foreign fossil fuels, because, people like Fox News will treat that as though it's a suitable shorthand or suitable, midway to the point in which we, fully divest from fossil fuels. When in reality, they just want to like drill more in like public land. They want to drill more in public land. They want to, have the past 30 years of environmental regulations continue to be rolled back. And, then we will never move forward to that next step of actually, fighting climate change.
And this is why go ahead, Matt.
I also like the idea that this issue is on the same scale to Faulkner and the rest of Fox News, I assume, as a once in a 100-year pandemic. Like we had to ramp up our medical capabilities, our science laboratories, so we can get this vaccine to save lives. Why can't we do the same so people can save $2 at the gasoline tanks? It's ridiculous to even like compare the two, first of all. Also, another thing is the one of the reasons why we don't produce more oil is because they can't find enough workers to do this. Like the job sucks. and they just don't have enough workers, or they're not paying more correctly. They're not paying the appropriate amount to people to do this type of work.
It seems to me that there's like, and I want to bounce this off of you guys, and I keep saying this over and over again, but what I don't understand is why there is no, and I understand, I guess, to some extent why there would be hesitancy to do this, but it seems to me that the best response to this type of pablum that we hear is accept the premise. Yes, this is a national security issue. This is a national emergency. We need to do what we did during World War II, and that is really take over this industry and put it under the auspices of the United States government. We should nationalize all energy production in this country because it is a national security issue. And then just watch them run for the hills, like force them into a situation where their talking points feed into what is essentially an apocalyptic vision for them, which, of course, is not going to happen. And frankly, if it did, that would still be okay, because then we would be in the position to transition this, and we wouldn't have such a private, a massive private sort of a pool of money that was fighting against a transition to some type of green energy. But of course, it's more of a rhetorical trick. I mean, this is one of the things that I think is sort of like difficult for the left, is to deploy a rhetorical strategy that is, in some ways, seems divergent from where we want actual outcomes to come. But it seems to me that we need to sort of like maybe not, we need to defeat the oil industry first before we can actually go to green technology on some level.
Not to show off, Sam, but I one time read one book, just one. And, in that book, it explained the origins of both sort of our, carbon-based economic system, largely speaking, and transportation system. And also in explaining that, it also explained the origin of like national security becoming a mainstream phrase in our culture. And one thing it points to is like World War I and that era, post World War I, where, Western governments were doing their best to, accumulate rights to oil reserves in the Middle East, in places that weren't being used, in places that were being used, Afghanistan, Iraq, etc. And it was all under the veil of national security, specifically the idea that, not having access to these oil reserves will have a dramatic impact on our ability to wage war, our ability to, defend ourselves at home, abroad, etc. I think that we've seen in the modern day people use that argument, especially if the Pentagon comes out and says that, climate change is a national security emergency, and they're like the biggest national security emergency in some of their papers. People like Elizabeth Warren come out and use that framework as well. And I don't think there's anything inherently wrong with pointing out that it is in fact a national security emergency, because it is one. It's just, the types of solutions that people are inevitably going to point to tend to be military solutions. And by that, it means, I could imagine a world where people point out a type of green imperialism where we, are invading countries or trying to occupy countries or doing some kind of soft power regime in countries under the guise of preventing them from using the natural resources that we don't want them to use, as opposed to using them. But, at the same time, I feel like that's more of the traditional Republican, neoconservative framework that we work under. So we'd have to, in many ways, in talking about national security in that framework, we'd have to establish a new understanding of what it means to preserve our national security. The same with our public health, because in many ways, it's just been eroded to mean one thing, which is that we have to wage war over there so it doesn't come back home.
I mean, I think that's true to some extent, but I mean, we hear national security almost deployed in the context of even COVID. We heard it. I mean, if we say that, it is a national security. We accept the premise that, the need for oil, like this guy from the American Petroleum Institute is promoting, let's cut through red tape. Cut through red tape. That's not sufficient. Let's nationalize these. We, as a government and a people, we need to own these mechanisms. That's the most efficient way of delivering what we need, where we need it. Is the only way to be truly energy independent. would be to nationalize these things and not allow this oil to be sent to other places. We need to nationalize our refineries and retrofit them to deal with the type of oil that we produce in this country. And once I mean, I just think that, like, you know, I would love to see that guy have to answer a question. It'll never happen by some, you know, cable news host. Like, shouldn't we be nationalizing all of your clients, all of your members' assets in this country? Because, like you say, this is a national security issue, and everything else that's associated with national security, we theoretically have control over. Shouldn't we be doing that? I'd be curious as to what the answer was.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think it fits into that framework, you know, same framework as COVID fits into in terms of just like an overarching public health, national security, you know, social functioning framework. I think that it just tends, you know, and this has nothing to really do per se with a specific power the phrase national security has over our war machine. But, you know, our war machine is any hammer is a nail. And so any excuse to, you know, operate or fund it, regardless of what that excuse is, will, you know, be utilized. So I guess the question is, how do we reframe the entire conversation about national security to have solutions that don't necessarily have to be militaristic and, you know, people's heads automatically?